July 9, 1987, a crowd of million gathered to mourn a youth who died in the struggle for democracy. 1987 became the revolutionary year where Korea toppled the 30-year military dictatorship and gained independence all through the power of the people. The 20-year-old student who became the catalyst for the June democracy protests. His funeral procession became the turning point in modern Korean history that brought the dawn of a new age of democracy.
That, I think, was the turning point in the democratic revolution in Korea.
After 30 years of suffering under a military dictatorship, singing the national anthem in unison in the streets of Seoul was a form of resistance for the people.
So それだけ民主主義のために粘り強く闘争している国民は、もちろんアジアには他にはないと。
It was not just something given to you, but something the Koreans fought for, very many Koreans, and there were many victims because of it.
The road of endless struggle and sacrifice to restore human dignity. In the end, a story of success. This is the story of Korean democracy, of Korean history. At the end of the Second World War, Korea was freed from Japanese occupation. But by then, the country had been divided into North and South. The Korean War, a war between brothers, brought suffering and heartache. Following the war, the standoff between North and South remains the same today, over 50 years later. World War II, the biggest war recorded in the history of mankind. In 1945, after nearly 6 years, the age of World War drew to a close. When militarism was brought to its knees with the defeat of Germany and Japan, liberated from colonialism, Koreans came out running into the streets. Although freedom, equality, and the free world lay before them, not everything was as they hoped. The biggest problem was how to rebuild a nation on their own. Immediately after liberation, conservative and progressive political factions formed a committee to work toward founding the country. However, the process of independently establishing the country suffered a setback due to the U.S. military elimination of the left and the intensified internal conflict between the right and the left. Under the pretext of Japanese disarmament, the United States and the Soviet Union were stationed in both the North and South. Because of the difference in opinion between both countries, attempts to establish a single country failed. Korea, at once liberated but also divided, was confronted with tragedy. Despite thwarted dreams of a previous united nation, May 10, 1948, according to a UN resolution, South Korea held its first historic election. On the heels of August 15th and South Korea becoming an independent government, North Korea established itself as the Chosun Democratic People's Republic. Following liberation, the United States and the Soviet Union held the biggest influence over Korea's destiny. Both the US and the Soviet Union exerted political counterpressure in the North and South. Ultimately, the intensification of the Cold War on the peninsula brought huge tragedy. Not yet able to heal from the division of the country, the war brought more suffering. While the Korean War was a civil war with brothers aiming guns at one another, it was also an extension of the ideological clash of the US-Soviet Cold War. The 3-year war left 1/4 of the population, around 4,500,000 people, dead or injured. In addition, at the time of ceasefire, nearly 10 million families were separated. The war was a chance for both the North and South to solidify an extreme political system, and to the end became the last divided country in the world. Overcoming ruin and abject poverty was the most urgent matter. However, Ri Seung-man ignored this. By mobilizing military power to force through an amendment, as well as other illegal, dishonest election tactics, he attempted to seize permanent political power. As a result, it incited the April 19th Revolution. The April 19th Revolution was the first victory for the people in the fight for democracy. During the war, President Ri Seung-man secretly took refuge in Busan. As his re-election via parliament looked unlikely, he used military power to push through a constitutional amendment to make the presidency a directly elected position. He also went ahead and passed an amendment to remove term limits and allow for unlimited re-election. During the 4th presidential election, the fraudulent measures reached an extreme. Public servants and the police were mobilized, votes were tripled and quintupled, and when ballots outnumbered the number of voters, ballot boxes were burned. In an election that transcended imagination, Ri Seung-man won a 4th consecutive term. But the people would not take it any longer, which led to one of the unforgettable moments in the history of democracy. When the body of a high school student who had died from a tear gas bomb was discovered in Masan Harbor, the public exploded in rage. Students and citizens poured into the streets and demanded the election be nullified, and Ri Seung-man resigned. The government mobilized gangsters who violently attempted to quell the protesters, which only fueled the people's rage. As the number of demonstrators swelled over 100,000, which included elementary school students, police opened fire on the crowd and killed around 180 civilians. After a month of protests, the 12-year dictatorship was brought to its knees. Cheers lauding a new age democracy rang out across the nation. Toppling the dictatorship was the first major victory.
역사적으로는 당시 모든 국민들이 민주주의라는 건 이런 것이다. 그리고 그 민주주의를 만드는데 나도 참여를 했고 일조를 했다. 그러니까 한국 사회의 민주주의는 바로 다른 사람의 민주주의가 아니고 우리 국민들, 나의 것이다 하는 자각을 4.19 항쟁을 통해서 했다고 할 수가 있는 거죠.
The April 19th revolution was not planned. What started as an innocent student movement became a people's revolution. Through the April 19th revolution, Koreans discovered that the essence of and the path toward a democratic government lay in the hands of the people. The joy of the first democratic revolution was short-lived. On the pretense of social unrest, a company of soldiers led by guns and tanks seized control of the country. Korean society entered a period of a long, cold winter republic, ruled for 18 years under the iron fist of Park Chung-hee's military junta, armed in the name of modernization and anti-communism. As a result of the April 19th revolution, the Second Republic was established. However, the new government hardly punished the person responsible for opening fire on the people during the revolution, as well as those who had accumulated wealth by illicit means. The new government couldn't accept the people's demands for democracy. Its military was a threat to politics. May 16, 1961 at dawn, a military coup d'etat took over the capital with the force of 3,500 soldiers led by guns and tanks.
반공을 국시의 제1위로 삼고 지금까지 형식적이고 구호에만 그친 반공 태세를 재정비 강화한다.
Under the coup d'etat, emergency martial law was declared for the entire country, and the legislation, administration, and judicial powers were entrusted to a National Reconstruction High Council. In the midst of all this was Park Chung-hee. In the early 1960s, Korea, entirely dependent on the U.S. for aid, was one of the poorest countries in the world. The people of Korea who had undergone Japanese occupation, then following liberation had to endure a war, were left suffering from abject poverty, wanting nothing more than economic independence and development. During this time, Park Chung-hee, who had come to power by a coup d'etat, sought to legitimize his position by advocating for Korean modernization and economic growth policies. At that time, a passion for education became a strong incentive for efforts to wipe out illiteracy in rural areas. In order to secure funds needed for economic development, Park Chung-hee hastily went ahead with a Korean-Japanese agreement despite opposition from the vast majority of the country. The content of the agreement was humiliating as it only included loans and uncertain provisions as opposed to compensation for victims, and made no demand for an apology or liability for the occupation of the peninsula. The public's indignation incited demonstrations to overthrow the government. In spite of public resistance, Park Chung-hee proclaimed a state of emergency martial law and carried out the Korean-Japanese agreement. This matter of Japan apologizing and paying reparations has still not been settled even today. Park Chung-hee proceeded with his aggressive economic development plan. "Let's try living the good life" became the motto at the workplace. However, the conglomerate-centered economic growth that received full government support led to an imbalance in regional industrial development, as well as the transformation of displaced farmers into urban poor low-wage laborers. While they worked late into the night in the name of economic growth, it was through their efforts that Korea was able to achieve miraculous urban and industrial rapid growth. In order to earn money in the 1960s, child laborers flocked to the Cheonggyecheon Peace Market in Seoul. At the time, 22 years old, he was the youth who killed himself by fire as statement on behalf of them all. Seoul Peace Market at that time was crowded with sewing factories. Young girls, aged 12 to 17, worked 14 hours a day for 50 won, the price of a cup of coffee. Chun Tae-il, desperate from inhumane, harsh labor conditions, fought a lonely fight for workers' rights. Chun Tae-il's suicide exposed the stark contradictions of the growing corporate-focused economy building on low wages and oppressed labor.
내 하나 죽으면은 요 바늘구역 막 조금 캄캄한 데서 바늘구역 막끔 햇빛이 비치면은 그걸 보고 노동자들하고 학생들하고 같이 죽기 싸우고 잡혀가고 하면은 그 구멍이 조금씩 넓어진다고 그랬어. 아무것도 안 보이는 데서 시킨 대로 하고 그 사람들이 그 구멍을 보면 자기를 볼 수 있는 것이 비친다는 거예요.
Chun Tae-il, who said that workers had to see themselves for who they are in order to achieve labor rights. His death by fire cast a huge light on the Korean labor movement and became a chance to pull the labor issue into the democracy movement as well as the Korean social movement. The people were in an uproar, and anti-three-term amendment demonstrations calling for the impeachment of Park Chung-hee swept the country because he had underhandedly changed the constitution in order to run for a third term. The people's violent resistance to corruption and the three-term amendment posed a big threat to Park Chung-hee.
나를 대통령으로 한 번 더 뽑아주십시오 하는 이런 정치 연설은 오늘 이 기회가 마지막 연설이 될 것이라는 것을 확실히 말씀드립니다.
In the end, Park Chung-hee won the 7th presidential election with the help of his appeal that it would be the last run, as well as some election fraud. Moving into the 1970s, the demands for democracy were weakening. In July of 1971, the group of judges resigning in protest caused upheaval in that judicial branch, followed by political defiance from within the ruling party that began to create a split. Park Chung-hee began to feel the threat to his political existence. He ordered armed soldiers to be stationed on campuses, forced the leaders of student movements to join the military, and demanded even stronger measures to control society. Finally, Park Chung-hee's revitalizing reform constitution ensured everlasting political power. The new constitution called the basic principles of democracy, including the separation of powers and a competitive election system, into question by legally giving all political power to one person. Park Chung-hee declared a state of national emergency and squelched any debate of the new law by instituting a new constitution.
박정희 씨는 그때 당시 유정예라고 하는 이와 같은 마술 방망이를 통해 갖고 언제든지 헌법을 고칠 수도 있고 무슨 법이든 마음대로 통과시킬 수 있고 국회를 갖다가 사실상 말하자면은 박정희 씨 개인의 권력 도구로 전락시켜 버린 거죠.
December 23, 1972, running as the only candidate, Park Chung-hee was re-elected in the 8th presidential election at the National Conference of Unification, as specified in the Yushin Constitution. Although there was a set term, the unlimited re-election clause set the president apart, completely ignoring the basic principles of democracy. Control and suppression increased in order to crush the foundation of resistance. Park Chung-hee used anti-communist ideology and strong nationalism to justify the dictatorship. In an attempt to cut off the anti-Yushin movement, he didn't hesitate to send armed soldiers into campuses. In addition, long hair and guitars, which had become symbols of the youth culture of resistance, were prohibited under the pretext of the crackdown on corrupt. Limits were placed on permissible skirt length for women, and songs with critical lyrics were also prohibited. Suppressive regulations extended to all aspects of daily life.
사회를 통제하다 보면 정치적인 반대파들만 통제해서 되는 게 아니고 맨 밑바닥에 있는 사람부터 시작해서 상층부 사람까지를 다 통제해야 되고, 그리고 거기에는 사람들이 생각하는 거, 생활 습관, 의식까지도 통제를 해야 완전 무결한 1인 독재 체제가 이루어지는 것입니다.
The more severe the oppression got, the greater the resistance. Across the country, the anti-Yushin movement was approaching critical mass as the numbers kept growing. As the situation got more serious, the response was an emergency decree.
대통령 긴급조치 제1호 1. 대한민국 헌법을 부정, 반대, 왜곡 또는 비방하는 일제의 행위를 금한다.
It was a time where one could get sent to prison for a single word spoken or a single line written. Anti-Yushin intellectuals were punished with the emergency measures that predated the revitalizing reform constitution. By the end of Park Chung-hee's reign, he had issued 9 emergency decrees and imprisoned around 2,200 students and citizens. In addition, under the Yushin government, a spy scandal was fabricated in order to completely choke out the power behind the anti-Yushin movement. The press was also muzzled from saying anything critical about the government. Soon after Donga Ilbo newspaper reporters made the Donga Free Press Action Manifesto, Park Chung-hee threatened advertisers in the paper, which led to a discontinuation of advertising. The empty space where the advertisements had been was filled with words of encouragement from readers nationwide that had surged in. However, in the end, 130 reporters were fired. Park Chung-hee made the name prisoner of conscience through this type of oppressive actions. Under the Yushin Constitution, students and intellectuals were compelled to take the lead in the resistance, even from abroad. They participated in a campaign against life-saving. The participation of the religious sector, such as churches who could generate support from the outside world, was a distinguishing feature of this period. The quote-unquote dissonant affair became a government-sanctioned judicial killing when activists arrested for allegedly attempting to overthrow the government were sentenced to death. After receiving the death penalty, not a day passed before the 8 activists were executed. At that time, the International Lawyers Association pronounced that day Judicial History Black Day. It would not be until 32 years later in 2007 that the 8 who died on false charges would be declared innocent by the Supreme Court. August 11, 1979, workers protesting their dismissal from the YH Company were holding a sit-in at the First Opposition Party headquarters. The police marched onto the premises and forcibly removed the women and hauled them away. During the course of this, Opposition Party leader Kim Young-sam and other National Assembly members were attacked. After the YH sit-in, Kim Young-sam publicly criticized the president's actions, who in turn had Kim Young-sam expelled from the National Assembly. On October 16, 1979, the Sangsu Bridge, the 11th bridge of the Han River, was opened to the public. The anti-dictatorship protest against Park Chung-hee took place in Busan, the second largest city in Korea. During the second day of the rally, the protest grew into a large-scale civil movement. During the commemoration dinner reception of the proclamation of Yushin system, the number of protesters grew rapidly by the hour, which led Park Chung-hee to declare martial law to take control of the situation. This was the largest anti-dictatorship movement after the April 19th revolution. The movement spread out into the Masan province, which led on to bringing an end to the Yushin regime. There was evidence of internal conflict with Park Chung-hee's cabinet, which many say was influenced by the Burma Democratic Movement. October 26 morning, Park Chung-hee conducted his usual on-the-spot industrial inspections in what became his last official public appearance. Park Chung-hee was assassinated that night by Kim Jae-kyu, the head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, who was against the regime's policies regarding the use of force against protesters. Park Chung-hee's assassination occurred 18 years after he took control over the country and 7 years after the proclamation of the Yushin regime. The hope for democracy lasted only a short period after the end of Park Chung-hee's military regime. The army once again initiated control over Korea. Notwithstanding the government suppression, many citizens who inherited the self-sacrificing spirits of the protesters during the May 18th democratic movement continued on with their anti-government protest. The military regime came to an end after 18 years. students and supporters of democracy were hopeful that they were a step closer to democratization. They referred to this time of hope as Seoul Spring. However, Seoul was occupied by the military once again by soldiers belonging to Hanawe, an illegal political group within the military. The leader, General Chun Do-hwan, maintained the preservation of public peace.
많은 사람들은 민주화가 이루어질 거라고 이제 기대를 했습니다. 서울의 봄식에 많은 사람들은 한편으로 이제 그걸 기대를 했고, 다른 한편으로는 주로 이제 박정의 독재 체제 속에서 수혜를 받은 기득권 계층, 그다음에 박정의 어떤 세력의 이제 후계 세력들, 이런 세력들은 거기에 반대를 했었습니다. 공개적으로 얘기를 못했습니다만.
The new military authorities imposed martial law nationwide, and certain political figures were charged and interrogated. Notwithstanding this political turmoil, the citizens of Gwangju continued to conduct anti-government protests, and the new military authorities chose Gwangju as an easy mark to depress the public conviction for democracy. On the third day of the protest, the military deterred the democratic movement by using arms against the protesters, which only led to the increase of the number of voluntary citizen protesters and the level of intensity of the demonstrations. 200 or more vehicle rallies participated in the protest, and the number of protesters went up to 200,000. On May 21st, at 1 p.m., the military forces volleyed the Gwangju citizens in unison. The people attacked by the military that day were civilians who started off their day as any other. The rage of the citizens enhanced rapidly and developed into a people's uprising due to the immense brutality of the airborne unit. The civilian army attained arms to defend the lives of Gwangju. Citizens who were mostly focused on making a living for their family were now putting their focus on fighting back against the country's armed forces. Notwithstanding airborne units' group attack, Gwangju citizens came out and filled the city. After 4 days of an ongoing battle that killed and wounded hundreds of citizens, the military forces evacuated the city. It seemed as if peace had long last been recovered.
I was impressed with the people there and the spirit that there was in the city when it was surrounded by the military and cut off from the rest of the world. The people were very hospitable. They were very disciplined. There was no unnecessary violence or anything. They went about their daily lives as best they could, and they seemed determined to further their cause.
Gwangju was liberated after the citizens took control over the office of the provincial government. Through this incident, Gwangju citizens aroused the power of the people and portrayed the strength of genuine autonomy. The citizens tried to go back to their normal lives, and the civilian army took control over public security and order. The citizens shared the food which was available. The citizens portrayed an image of mature democratic society. This was a liberated Gwangju. On May 27th at dawn, the military once again seized the office of the provincial government, and the 10-day protest came to an end. The May 18th democratic movement brought about the deaths of more than 200 civilian lives and the injuries of more than 3,500. Later on, efforts to compensate and restore the impaired reputation of victims were made. Hearings were held to get to the bottom of the massacre and other relevant incidents. But appropriate punishment for the responsible figures behind the massacre did not take place, and the case remains unresolved to this day due to the concealment of facts and evidence by the military regime of that time. The heated uprising of the Gwangju citizens led to the democratization of Korea after the 1980s, and the Gwangju citizens provided the foundation for future pro-democracy movements. The new military authorities who suppressed the May 18th democratic movement by force established an Emergency National Defense Commission, May 31st, 1980. The military authorities forcefully and violently hauled nearly 40,000 people claimed to be lawbreakers or anti-government group members, subjecting them to military training and merciless torture in the name of humanitarian reform. Chun Do-hwan inaugurated as president. First, the new military regime shut down 44 newspapers and broadcasting agencies across the nation and blocked access to information in the name of promoting a healthy media environment. Then, the new military administration revoked the curfew that had been enforced for nearly 37 years to appease the public's resistance. The government founded Korean professional sports teams in local areas and organized large-scale festivals to direct the citizens' attention from politics to other less political areas. Students and supporters of democracy protested in unison against the Chun Do-hwan administration and the U.S., who they say abetted the Gwangju massacre. The Chun regime strongly fought back by arresting and torturing the students and democratic supporters. In 1986, attention was focused on revising the Constitution for direct presidential elections so as to destruct the regime's military dictatorship. Students and non-governmental institutions initiated a petition signed by 10 million citizens to revise the Constitution for a direct presidential election system. Citizens oppose against government's torture tactics and request for a revisal of the Constitution. However, President Chun Do-hwan refuses the revision of the Constitution for a direct presidential election system and announces a statement that the government would adhere to the current Constitution. The entire nation was stirred up by the desire for democracy. June 10, 1987, at noon, the Civic Democratic Constitutional Law Security Movement headquarters, which was the center of the June Democratic Movement, declared this day as the end of the 40-year political dictatorship. During that same period, the Democratic Justice Party, the government ruling party, organized a general meeting for the next presidential candidacy.
민주정의당 차기 대통령 후보로 노태우 후보가 선출되었음을 선포합니다.
The ruling party's general meeting was considered a ground for power succession for presidential candidate Roh Tae-woo, who washed his hands with the blood of Gwangju citizens by initiating the coup with Chun Do-hwan. With the coordination of the Democratic Movement Commission, the sounds of bells rang across the city of Seoul. This sound marked the new day of democracy. As the bells rang, citizens clapped in response. Vehicles rang their horns in unison. People inside the vehicles waved their scarves to express their hearts for democracy. Everyone shared the similar desire and hope for democracy. Demonstrators went inside of the Myeongdong Catholic Church after a back-and-forth struggle with the police. 750 people participated in the demonstration, which lasted for 6 days and 5 nights.
애로운 싸움이 아니었죠. 여기서는 뭐 점심 때마다 이렇게 막 다 지지를 확인받고 그러니까 이제 우리는 어떻게든지 끝까지 여기 사수해가지고 전두환이 대통령 자리에 물러나게 만들겠다. 이제 이제 학생으로서 그때 생각인데 사실 그렇게까지는 되기는 어려운 상황이었겠지만 전두환 물러날 거다 어쨌든지 뭐 그런 생각을 했고.
All doors or paths were blocked and wounded people increased due to the collision with the police. Citizens who found out about the isolated student protesters fighting against the police began to make donations. Goods were collected from here and there. Lunchboxes filled with food were provided by female high school students, were especially helpful during that time.
처음에는 이제 많은 양이 아니었는데 이제 우리 이제 농성하던 시민 학생들이 그걸 먹고 깨끗이 씻어서 또 이제 답장을 써서 다시 이 자리에 갖다 놨는데 그 다음 날 보니까 도시락이 이만큼 왔어요. 학생들이 모두 다 모은 거죠, 같이들. 그 쪽지 하나씩 다 써서 그 생각하면 지금도 눈물이 나는데.
The six-day demonstration at the Myeongdong Catholic Church acted as a stepping stone for the democratic movement that occurred for more than 15 days. During lunchtime, white-collar workers sat across the student demonstrators and cried out in unison. It was a time when the political perspective of many people were distinguished.
전두환 정권에 대한 반대하는 마음은 다 있었죠. 학생들이 호언철폐 독재 타도하는데 무서워서 그 동참을 못한 거지. 호언철폐 독재 타도 그거는 뭐 다 마음속으로 외치고 있었는데 직접 이제 체류탄을 맞으니까 그 소리가 그냥 누구 입에서 튀어나오면은 다 따라 나오는 입장이에요.
June marked the month of hope for all. The so-called necktie unit, or the white-collar workers, rose as central force that led the June democratic movement. On June 26, a national peace parade marking the retrieval of a democratic constitutional law was conducted in 34 different cities under the security of 60,000 police officers. A national peace parade is carried out. Students led the front of the parade, but most of the participants were citizens. From workers to farmers and students, the hearts of all citizens were filled with hope and longing for democracy. The size of the demonstrations increased as the citizens across the country were all participating. Nearly 1 million people participated in the national demonstration.
All the workers joined together with the students, and we realized at that moment this was no longer a student movement, but this was mass citizen democratic struggle.
On the 19th day of resistance, Chun Du-hwan's regime organized a special talk.
여야 합의하에 조속히 대통령 직선제 개헌을 하고
The direct presidential election system was restored after 16 years. This implied the opportunity to develop into a democratic system. The June democratic resistance was the victory of democracy.
4.19 민주혁명은 아쉽습니다만 미완의 혁명이었죠. 이 미완의 혁명이 27년이 지난 87년에 와서 완결된 측면이 있습니다. 이런 의미에서 87년은 우리 청년 학생 시민들이 중심이 되어서 박정희 유신 독재와 전두환 군부 독재를 타파하기 위해서 무려 27년 동안 노력한 그 결실이라고 우리가 칭송할 수 있습니다.
The June Democratic Movement was the first citizens' revolution after Korea obtained its national independence. From the April 19th Revolution to the May 18th Democratic Movement and the June Democratic Movement, the death of a young Korean that marked the milestone of Korean history. Their genuine spirits was the valuable driving force behind Korea's step into the new day of democracy. The June Democratic Movement was not completed because they lost the opportunity for a change in political power. However, there was no stopping the forward movement to democratization. The victory of democracy obtained through the June Democratic Movement increased the people's confidence towards the peace and reunification movement of South and North Korea. The 1987 Democratic Movement was not only a political movement for democratization, but also an opportunity for the public mass like laborers and the farmers to participate in the making of history. The laborers fought to retain the suppressed labor rights through a 3-month protest that began in July 1987. During the winter of 1987, a direct presidential election took place after 16 years. However, presidential candidates of the opposition party, Kim Yong-sam and Kim Dae-jung, failed to unify the candidacy. Nevertheless, Korea was stepping closer towards a peaceful administration change. With the achievement of democratization through the June Democratic Movement, the hopes of the Korean citizens were focused on the reunification of South and North Korea. In March and June 1989, one of the leaders of the democratization movements, Minister Moon Ik-hwan, and college student Lim Soo-kyung visited North Korea, the first of any South Koreans in nearly 40 years. August 1996 marks a milestone in the history of Korea's democratization movements. Former Presidents Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo are indicted for their roles in the 1979 coup and in the 1980 massacre of pro-democracy demonstrators. 16 years after the incidents occurred, the two were trialed for the rebellion and the conspiracy of the rebellion. After 60 years, the two top officials of South and North Korea meet in June 2000. The summit marked an important transition from conflict and hostility between the two Koreas to reconciliation and cooperation. Korea is evaluated as a successful case for democratization and industrialization.
I saw this year.
Korea is a model for some East Asian countries and East Asian activists that are longing for national democratization.
Huge economic development in many terms.
We have our own democratization struggle. It's ongoing, but keeping it at a high level and sustaining it with the same stamina and vigor as the actual uprisings is one thing, and I want to learn it.
I think Korean society has a long-term struggle for democracy. It's not just one day or 1 month, but they have a long time, so many years, because people have a strong spirit to fight.
What Koreans wanted was democracy. The recent history of Korea is that of struggle. A struggle that was built upon a small wish for a society that values reason, common sense, and conscience. And of course, Koreans still have many issues to overcome, such as setting past history straight, clearing the remnants of military dictatorship, overcoming the Cold War state, and achieving true peace for the Korean Peninsula, and many more. But now, democracy in Korea has become an irreversible and massive stream.
Korea, in my mind, is a very vibrant democracy.
This is what democracy is all about, and you should be very proud that you have achieved that.
Peace for the Korean Peninsula. Democracy for people worldwide. Joining hands and taking action for peace. In every sector, Koreans in their effort to realize a true democracy goes on, and they continue to rewrite the history of democracy.